Got a pretty good crowd here so far today. Welcome to today's Behind the Science, a Wednesday web chat, where we get to highlight some of our amazing researchers. I'm Madeline Arancibia, I'll be your host, and joining us today, we also have Amanda Nickerson, our Director of Development, and Dr. Jim Sullivan, our Executive Director. Today's web chat is going to feature Dr. Greg Okori-Crow, who's been at Harbor Branch for 12 years. His research focuses on the ecology, behavior, and evolution of marine apex predators. His work has spanned from pole to pole and focuses on fascinating animals like polar bears, Steller sea lions, ice seals, and even beluga whales. So we'll chat with him. I've got a bunch of questions for him, and we also want to hear the questions that you guys have. So if you're on Zoom, you're going to go ahead and use that Q&A button in the bottom center of your screen to ask your questions. If you're streaming on Facebook, we'd love to hear from you as well. You can just comment your questions, and we'll try to get to those questions as well towards the second half of our chat. So with that, thank you so much, Greg, for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, we should, I guess, jump in. Before we get to the questions, though, first thing that I would like to hear from you is, could you tell us 3 things that we should know about you?
Oh, boy. Well, I grew up in Ireland, so I suppose that's an important one. Married with 1 daughter, teenage daughter, and this is an interesting one. I was never great at school, so I think I was a late developer, and so to anybody out there, I guess I would say is don't lose hope. I was a slow starter, so those would be
all right. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty there. You guys might not have seen Greg, but we're going to get him on your screen in just a second. So for the next question, what inspired you to pursue a career in science then? If you said you weren't really great at school, what was that little thing that inspired everything?
Well, I guess when I was young, certainly I had a deep love of nature. I grew up, most of my childhood was in the country, so I was out all the time. Probably not in school a lot, but I was outside all the time. I think my dad had a big influence on me. My father, you know, his family were farmers, and he went to college and became an agricultural scientist and a veterinary surgeon. And so I spent a lot of time with him. And then, you know, there's been so many people I think that influenced me, but one man in particular, when I was growing up, we had this neighbor who was a very unusual character. He built his own cabin. He lived along the river. He was a real river man. And he was kind of a Renaissance man. He tied fishing flies. He did taxidermy. He was an artist. He played the fiddle. And maybe he made me realize you could live life on your terms, your way. And, you know, you don't have to fit inside a box. And I think that had a huge influence on me as a kid growing up.
So what was your journey from the kid in Ireland to where you are now as this fantastic, interesting researcher?
It is a long and winding road. I was talking to a friend recently, and basically there's 2 ways to go about it, right? You can learn what it is you need to do and then figure out what you want to do. Or you can figure out what you want to do and then figure out how you're going to get there. And I think that's the road I took. Maybe the road less traveled, but I was always open to the next opportunity. You know, after Ireland, I came out to the States, no job, just a couple of degrees in my back pocket. And I got a break working in NOAA Fisheries in San Diego in California. I had a 3-month contract to do some genetic work on beluga whales, and I was over the moon. I couldn't believe I was going to get to work in the Arctic, a dream of mine. But then it was very much, it's up to you to make the most of this. And I think that's the American way, right? It's, you get a break, you get a shot at something, but then it's up to you. And I guess I really relished that kind of approach and managed to develop a career, as it were, in marine mammal research, very different to what my PhD was, which was on terrestrial mammals. And then, yeah, 12 years ago, came to Harbour Branch, kind of brought my whole group and my research program with me, and, you know, expanded to look at things in more tropical and temperate environments, and you know, been managed to, I guess, to make a life out of it.
So were you in California up until you came to Florida? Or what drew you to Harbour Branch specifically?
So, you know, basically my wife and I were at a point where we were both looking for research positions. It's very hard when you have two people. And there was, as you recall, sort of an investment in science happening, a very exciting period with research in Florida. So that certainly attracted us. And I wasn't probably the most natural fit for Harbour Branch, having most of my research in, you know, polar and colder climates. But Harbour Branch was a very welcoming place. And, you know, I got a break here, and it was just at the time they were merging with FEU. So it was kind of a very dynamic, somewhat confusing period of my career. But it's all worked out really well.
That's fantastic. And we're lucky to have you. And I'm guessing that you still get to do some of your work in the Arctic, even though we're in this lovely tropical area.
I do. And I'm the envy, I know, of a lot of my colleagues who maybe live a little further north as to where I get to live. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, my research is very strongly molecular. And so there's wonderful facilities here at Harbour Branch FAU. And really, as a scientist, you have a passport to work anywhere and ideally live anywhere. But I do. I spend a lot of time, it's still very much in Alaska and Canada. I've been very fortunate to work around the pole. And I love going back, yeah.
I'm pretty jealous myself of the adventures. So of all of the projects that you've worked on, which has been your favorite and why?
Ooh, gosh. That's a tough one. I will say a unifying theme through a lot of my research going way back to undergrad and graduate school has been understanding social structure, social species. And so working with beluga whales for over 2 decades now, every day I'm constantly excited and surprised at some of the findings we have or we make as to the social lives and of these species. We recently put forward the idea that, you know, beluga whales and many other species form these elaborate cultures, which is not so much controversial, but it's certainly not typically applied to non-primate species. And now we're trying to get in more depth into sort of understanding how social species use social learning to adjust behaviors based on changing environmental patterns. So I would say there's a deep love of belugas, but I'm very lucky. I get to work on dolphins, I get to work on polar bears, sea lions, and every one of them is unique with just unique opportunities. And I try and tell myself not to take anything for granted. You know, I mean, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what is the coolest place that your work has ever taken you? You've mentioned Alaska and Canada.
Wow. Another tough one.
I got all the tough questions.
I think a lot of the attraction to where to what I work on is where I work. You know, I do like the stark beauty and even the bleakness sometimes of some of the Arctic landscapes. Some places like Yakutat Bay in Alaska are so magnificent. They're almost overwhelming. You know, the mountains are so sheer, the glaciers are so huge that you just can't take it in. Parts of Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic have this beautiful red sandstone cliffs that are kind of surprising out in the middle of the Arctic. These magnificent stones that you know, in the midnight sun turn a beautiful red. You know, Svalbard, Chukotka in Russia, again, same thing, very, very dramatic scenery. I think somehow the more remote, or maybe the more grand the landscape, I think, the better.
Just by the fact that you use the term midnight sun means that you have gone to some dramatically different environments than most of us are used to.
True. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah. You just watch the sun go around the sky, you know, and you lose track of time.
How long are your fields? Weeks, months?
Usually between 3 weeks and 6 weeks, sometimes a couple of months. Sometimes they might be longer for various reasons, usually challenges in getting home or getting out of a place. You know, the logistics can be tough and stranded for a while. So you develop a kind of a patience and a kind of stoic philosophy where, you know, research and life doesn't work on your time schedule. It doesn't work very often the way you want it. So it's not for everybody. I think a lot of scientists do it for a year or two and they're like, you know, I want something a little more predictable.
So on all of those adventures, what's the coolest animal you've encountered during the field work?
Ooh. Well, I mean, polar bears are very special. And I think they're special not just because they're absolutely magnificent, but you immediately feel like you are not the one in charge of the scene. You know, that it's a humbling experience that I think as humans we don't often have in nature, and it's a good thing to feel that at times. So a lot of things are going through your mind at the same time. I think working with narwhals was almost like a religious experience because they are such a mythical creature that the anticipation of seeing one is so great, and then you see one and you just still can't believe what you're seeing. And I very fortunately was on a project once where we caught and tagged a bunch of narwhals. But you know, obviously there's a special case for belugas as well, and several, you know, Steller sea lions are these magnificent giant pinnipeds. Like, they are just so colossal that I was awestruck at the size of these animals. So,
for people who might not be familiar with Steller sea lions, could you give us an estimate of weight for those animals?
gosh, I'm probably going to get this wrong, so I hope there's no Steller sea lions.
Estimate.
Probably up to 2,000 pounds, I would say. I mean, there is, you know, they're not going to fit through the door, basically, of your house. They're not even going to fit through a double door. And so if you're crawling up a steep rock and they're above you, they're very imposing animals. And just the drama that unfolds in front of you on a sea lion rookery, there's so much, you know, epic battles and turf wars, and everything's happening at the same time. And you know, somewhere like the Aleutian Islands is so rugged and so wild. You know, watching killer whales come in and hunt sea lions right in front of you, you know, it's almost too much. You know, nature is just going off all around you, especially when you're in a little rubber boat. So, yeah, I think I have a hard time telling you which one.
I can understand. It's been 15 minutes of talking to you, and I'm ready to hide in one of your suitcases the next time you go on a field expedition, because
Okay.
I can only imagine that glory. I was lucky enough to work with South American sea lions for my master's degree,
Okay,
so
great. What
I
I'm talking about.
yeah, so I want to come on all your adventures now. So the next question that I've got here is, during your research, have you ever had a surprising result that led to something really exciting?
Yes, actually. I mean, actually, I'm constantly surprised by a lot of the results. It's a very humbling sometimes experience. You know, we develop our predictions. Sometimes they come through, and we give ourselves a slap on the back. But other times, surprising things happen, and of course, that's actually even cooler, right? I mean, I think scientists should be constantly wowed, or else it would get very predictable. A couple of things. When we started putting satellite tags on beluga whales first, I think the general dogma was they're coastal, they're shallow water animals. You know, they live on the continental shelf in places like the Chukchi Sea, and they just tootle back and forth with the ice. And you know, we put those tags on, and those animals went under the ice cap hundreds and hundreds of miles towards the pole. They dove to 3,000 feet, everything. I mean, I think people initially thought there was something wrong with the tags. Um, the work we're doing right now on social structure in beluga whales is really exciting. And this actually is very recent research where, you know, we predicted these beluga whales would only hang out with close relatives like killer whales or sperm whales. And that's not seeming to be the case. In another study on sea lions, you'll like this, Madeline, we went to a series of rookeries where we thought they were all from one population, and we found they were from two populations, and it changed our whole sort of understanding of what sea lions do. And then closer to home, looking at bottlenose dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon, you know, colleagues of mine, we were struck by how solitary a lot of dolphins are. They spend a lot of time on their own. Um, and so all of these things, you know, they constantly make you rethink things and change the direction you're going. So, yeah, I'm used to surprise.
There's still so much that we don't know. That's why we have jobs, so we can learn more about them.
Exactly.
Well, a quick reminder before we keep moving on with the questions that I have, if anyone from the public has questions for Greg about his fantastic experiences or his work, please go ahead and ask them. Again, on Zoom, use the Q&A button. On Facebook, comment and share your questions there, and we'll try and get to all of them shortly. So my next question is, can you tell us the importance of your work and how it's relevant to our lives?
Oh boy.
Easy.
I've only got a few seconds. Okay, let me see. I mean, I think a unifying aspect of a lot of our research at Harbour Branch and my own program, and I should give a shout out to Tatiana, Heidi, and Lisa in my group, and Danielle as well, is how vulnerable and at the same time how resilient nature is. And there's this kind of duality, you know, where we sometimes get very focused on the vulnerability, and that at times can lead to some paralysis in terms of what do we do. But nature is also very resilient. And actually, I think this is very relevant to us today and what the world is dealing with this pandemic. There's a lot of vulnerabilities out there, but there's a lot of resilience. I see it every day, you know, in the average person on the street and what they're doing, and we can't lose sight of that. So I think a lot of my research has actually become unified under this whole idea of vulnerability and resilience. And then I would say the other thing that might make my work more relevant to people is, and this sounds a little trite, you know, we are all connected. And I actually think nature is very important to us. And I think sometimes we forget that we kind of are connected and shouldn't forget those connections. And it's not something that you can put into words. It's a little maybe esoteric, but I do think there's some serious connections obviously there. So I suppose those are the two things that come to mind right now.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, it's really evident how resilient things are. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I think so.
hopefully this opens a lot of people's eyes to that hadn't realized it before. So if you could accomplish just one thing throughout the course of your career, what do you hope it is?
Gosh, these are very general questions and good ones. You know, I've spent a lot of my career definitely very, very focused on you know, research questions and the scientific method and that. But certainly in my later years, I kind of look more at the big picture. And I would say if I could accomplish anything, it would be to instill in people the idea that, you know, caring for nature is the most natural thing in the world. And what I mean is that, you know, we need to keep an open mind, you know, a curious mind about the world around us, you know, and it will reveal kind of its, you know, the universe as well, obviously its secrets. We need to be always learning and always open. And I think sometimes we get very closed-minded. I would even go so far as to say that, you know, the idea of fairness and justice is based on caring not just for ourselves, but I think on caring for the world around us. You know, we want to care for the people in it right now, but the idea that we all have a very deep kind of fundamental idea of fairness and justice comes from caring for the world around you. And, you know, there are things worth preserving. And I think, again, the idea of fairness and justice, there's things worth fighting for, right? So I think we all know what those things are. And I would be a champion for that kind of, you know, that it's okay to be that way. I hope that didn't sound too philosophical.
No.
You've got me in a philosophical mode, I think.
I'm enjoying it. And you know, if you can open people's eyes to that through your research and through your findings about the social structures of animals that we haven't thought about before, then that's going to be a pretty big success, I think.
Good, good. I hope so.
So probably, I would think less difficult question, but who knows? If you weren't a scientist, what profession would you choose? Totally, completely different question.
Okay, actually, sure. You know, everything I'm going to tell you, a lot of it sounds the same, you know, an explorer, all of that. But I'd probably be a farmer. I would probably, I like to see things grow. I like to be outside. So, you know, I come from a farming background. So I think a farmer, obviously my wildest dreams, of course, a rock star. That's a given.
I had a feeling based on your background there with the guitar.
No. That's definitely not happening. My daughter would absolutely have a heart attack. Yeah, I think a farmer.
Would you want to go back to Ireland and farm there?
In my mind, yes. That's how I see myself. Probably being a sheep farmer or something. I don't know. But making things grow, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that nature.
Nature. Yeah.
So back to more of the career-focused things, what you're doing now. What advice would you give a future scientist or young person who wants to pursue ocean science, or more specifically marine mammal research as a field?
Oh gosh. You know, let me see. Obviously, I'm someone who did kind of follow my passion, and so I would be very strongly in favor of that. I would encourage them to connect with professionals in the field who can tell them what it's like when The movie cameras have gone. You know, the realities. I think we have to level with people, you know, how challenging it can be, and how many different versions of being a scientist you can be. Like there's, you know, so I wouldn't dissuade people, but as you can all appreciate at Harbour Branch, you have to have a huge amount of hustle to kind of make it work, because that's what you're doing. You're kind of making it work. And I think we have to be fair to young people. But the other thing I would say is there's so many different ways to arrive at your destination. And again, I think my story is one that's pretty unconventional. I can tell you there's been many a mother who has looked in shock when I said, oh, I failed most of my exams in school. And they're like, what does my kid need to do? But, you know, eventually I got my act together and I did knuckle down, and I certainly did obviously manage to make it in the end. But yeah, you know, do your research, you know, think about it, talk to other people who are just ahead of you, you know, some graduate students, what have you, and take the opportunities when they come, you know, don't be afraid, be fearless.
So you're saying that I shouldn't hide in your suitcase.
If you're ready for a rough trip, then do it.
All right, so my last question before we get to the public questions, what do you think is the most fascinating thing about the ocean that most people don't know?
Gosh, I think most people know more about the ocean than I do. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm going to do that. There's so much to discover, but let me get there my own way. I mean, I think for anybody who has been on the ocean or stood and looked at the ocean, or, you know, the ocean never sleeps, right? Its moods, its rhythms, they kind of shape our moods, our rhythms, right? You know, we're that connected. You know, our DNA comes from the oceans, right? So it's like we've lost a connection sometimes that was always there. And so the fact that we know so little is kind of shocking in one way. It's more a case of we have forgotten so much. But there are people out there, you know, who haven't. I mean, artisanal fishermen, you know, people who go out and fish, the native hunters in Alaska and Canada and Russia and Greenland, you know, their connection to the ocean, you realize, God, you know, we used to have that. Big wave surfers, like they're connected to the ocean on another level. So I think it's about getting back to the connection we once had, you know, and I think a lot of that is about trying to learn more about the ocean. So I don't know if I could say anything surprising to the people listening in, but that's kind of how I look at it. You know, I think our moods, our rhythms, everything are in tune with the oceans.
All right, can't argue with that. So another reminder for everybody who's watching that if you want to hear your questions on Zoom, use the Q&A button in the middle bottom of your screen. And on Facebook, just go ahead and leave them in the comments. So the first question that I've got here is from someone named Grayson, asking if you're currently taking graduate students or advice for students hoping to continue their education on that next step past undergrad, I guess.
Well, Grayson, that's a very good question. I think like a lot of researchers, we would like to be probably always taking on more grad students. The way the systems, you know, the system works certainly in this country is we tend to have to find the research for those students, or the research dollars, I should say, for those students. And so, unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I can take on a lot of students, but I would encourage you to constantly reach out to people like myself. Things change all the time. And so in the age of social media, you know, blast away with you know, your questions to people such as myself. And I definitely, if that's what you're doing, I wish you the best. You know, hang in there, it'll happen for you, you know.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is from an anonymous attendee. What is your best tip for packing for the Arctic?
Layers. Pack layers. You know, the big woolen socks and the big woolly jumpers, that's in the days of Scott and Shackleton, heroes of mine, of course. Pack layers, be prepared for things to not go the way you would like, so kind of be chill. Have your little emergency pack with your tea bags and your toothbrush.
I love that tea is on your emergency.
Oh, that's top of the list.
Do you even have the hot water for the tea when you're in the Arctic?
I would fight a polar bear for hot water, trust me.
Next question we've got is from George. You worked with Steller sea lions. What's the most fascinating thing you found about their population along Alaskan rookeries? Other than that there were those two populations in the same rookery, since you already said that one.
Okay, God, that's a great question. You know, one of the things that struck us from the genetic work, working with people, you know, like Tom Gillette up in Alaska, is the interbreeding among rookeries, and how pups could disperse in some cases between rookeries, whereas the movement then between two other rookeries is much more reduced. So looking at a stepping stone of islands, you couldn't necessarily immediately understand where the population breaks might be. You couldn't necessarily predict. But when you started to look at kind of the oceanographic conditions and the bigger picture, you start to see that there are these oceanographic regimes that Steller sea lions sort of, their populations are shaped by. I think that has been really interesting. And now we're trying to get more and more into understanding why some rookeries are doing well and others are not doing well. Obviously, some are in very poor shape. And we're starting to move into other areas like epigenetics. So tune in and we'll hopefully tell you more about those in the future. But hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, so many interesting things. A question from Linda. Did you ever have a dangerous encounter with any of these animals?
Okay. I usually don't talk about them, to be honest, especially if my employers are listening. Yeah, I've had a few close shaves. Let's just leave it at that. I think you go into places accepting a certain amount of risk, right? There is a certain amount of risk. And it can be from weather, you know, but it can also be from animals. And you should never forget that these are very, very large, very powerful animals, much bigger than you. And that even when you're catching or tagging, you know, you're not always in control. You're probably never really in control. Polar bears certainly keep me up at night in my tent. That's certainly true. Yeah, let's just leave it at that.
It actually sort of leads into this next question from Jeannie. She mentions here that she was in, I'm probably going to say it wrong, Svalbard,
Oh, wow.
at 83 degrees north. And she was asking, how do you study an animal in that situation? How do you go about actually like getting your samples? I think is what she's getting at.
Well, you're a very lucky person to have gone there and gone so far north. We have worked with the Norwegian Polar Institute, Kit Kovacs, Christian Laderson are leaders in their field. And what you tend to do is use methods that allow you work in a place that is so, you know, challenging for maybe just a few weeks. So whether you're setting up a camp for a week or two, or whether you're on an icebreaker, you're going to use maybe telemetry or biopsy sampling with a crossbow, so that when you have those brief encounters with those animals, you try and collect as much information as you can. So maybe you put tags on a few, maybe you collect, like I said, tissue samples, maybe if it's a cetacean, you put hydrophones in the water, Now we're using eDNA, so we're collecting, you know, DNA from the water. So it's a very efficient operation. When you see a team pull together, you know, the logistics is very, very well dialed in. These polar and these northern temperate research teams really know what they're doing, because their opportunities to work with the animal is very limited. Whereas we're very fortunate down here with the Indian River Lagoon that we can go out every day and have a good chance of finding dolphins or manatees or what have you. So remote sensing. So I think technology is definitely helps. The other thing that is very important, and I really want to stress this, I haven't really talked about this, is the knowledge of Native Alaskans, northern peoples, the traditional knowledge. And so I spend a long time listening to the advice and knowledge of others who are the experts. I'm certainly not the expert. And I think scientists could do very well, no matter where they are in the world, to work with the locals and listen to the locals. Even here in the lagoon, you know, listen to the fishermen, listen to the people who live along the water. And so we rely a lot on advice and expertise of the locals. That's huge.
No. Next question here is from Savannah. During your research, have you seen the impact of glacial melting on the species that you study?
Wow, yes, incredibly, on an incredible scale as well, Savannah. There's places where, you know, when I started out, we would be iced in. Sea ice would be fast to shore, pack ice as far as the eye can see. I go there now, there isn't any ice to be seen, and the ice could have receded 300 miles. So it's incredibly dramatic. You know, ice melt is happening, you know, 3-4 weeks earlier. Freeze up is happening 3 or 4 weeks later. That's huge. And so all these polar species, you know, are trying to deal with these changes, but so are the communities, right? So are the people who live along and rely on the ocean. And a lot of my interest now has shifted into, again, looking at the vulnerabilities and the resilience of these entire systems, including the people who live in them. And as an example, where we're going with a lot of our beluga work is trying to understand how animals are going to adapt, and can they adapt quickly enough. And so a lot of our work now is looking at learning behavior. You know, how quickly can you learn? And if you think about it, a lot of these species have these cultures where they've done things the same for decades, centuries, maybe millennia, and now everything's changed. How are they going to deal with that? So it has become an unexpected but major part of my research. Good question.
Anne is asking, she's saying that she's sipping tea as she's watching, but she says, you've tackled the Arctic. Is Antarctica next?
Definitely, definitely. I've very luckily got to work on Antarctic Fur Seals. Madeline, you'll be happy to hear that. And that's been a dream of mine for a lot of reasons. A lot of my heroes were Antarctic explorers. There's a certain lure, obviously, of the Arctic, of wild places, other wild places. I would like to travel to, so yes.
All right. Actually, that goes into one of my questions. If you could travel anywhere in the world, what's the next place that you would pick?
Well, definitely in terms of kind of the adventure and the exploration, the Antarctic. I miss mountains in Florida. I would love to see the Himalayas. I would love to go to Tibet or somewhere like that. Oh God, yeah, that's an endless list. There are a lot of places I would like to go. Yeah.
Next question is from Dan, asking, are there now and or likely to be environmental effects of oil exploration or drilling in northern Alaska and the Arctic area?
Very, very relevant question, and yes, there's this constant tension, right, between limiting access to the more remote and pristine areas of the Arctic and allowing access. And, you know, there is a lot of interest, obviously, to explore and travel through the Arctic. Shipping has increased. You know, current administration is certainly making sounds to open up more of the Arctic and subarctic again. Where it gets complicated is very often for native communities across the region, resource extraction is the only source of revenue. So it's not a simple case of we're going to deny all of this because that is what pays for their schools and their healthcare and what have you. But obviously we all want things to be done in an environmentally responsible way. And one of the real worries, of course, with polar oil and gas exploration or what have you is if something goes wrong, it's probably going to go really wrong. You know, yeah, I think this is a big concern for all the Arctic nations, you know, who are all working together on this. And so we're involved in actually in a couple of research projects that directly relate to, you know, increasing interest in mining, in oil and gas development and how it might impact species. So, yeah.
All right. So a totally different type of question here from Sarah. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be?
Good Lord. Are they paying?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that's a long list.
Pick three.
Okay. One person I think most people may not know of that I would have loved to have dinner with was Michael Collins. Michael Collins was a rebel leader in Ireland over a century ago, and I think he has been a kind of a big hero of mine. A very capable young man, sadly, cut down in his prime. That would be one person for sure. And there are many others. The problem with heroes, of course, is, you know, you might regret sitting down and having a conversation with them. But yeah, I think he was a very passionate, very gifted person. And I think, you know, the Irish people owe a lot to him. So he'd be one.
Well, at our imaginary dinner, it can be as good of a conversation as you want it to be.
Oh, true.
So, all right, so our last question for the day, what do you like to do when you're not at work?
Well, I like to certainly hang out with my family and my friends, and I've spent a lot of time in the last week talking to people who are very close to me on WhatsApp and what have you, and that's very important to me, staying connected to people I care about. Music is very important to me, and that I really enjoy playing music, exercising, I suppose, getting outdoors in nature a lot. Trying to get things to grow in my garden, other than the weeds, that's fun too. Yeah, so.
Am I right that you're in one of the Harper Branch bands?
No,
No?
I'm not actually.
Okay.
Actually, here's my plug. Our band, Alternative Therapy, is based in Bureau, and everybody else in the band is incredibly talented. And you can check us out on Facebook. Sorry, there's my plug for my band.
That's okay. I'm sure people are looking for more entertainment, so why not? Well, thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to talk with us today. It was really fantastic getting to know you and hearing your philosophies and everything.
Well, thank you very much for hosting this, Melanie. You were great. And I really thank the people who tuned in, and I really thank your questions. And everybody, please, you know, stay safe out there.
Awesome. Well, yes, again, I'll reiterate his thanks for the fantastic questions that you guys provided. Preview for next week. Next week's Behind the Science is going to feature Dr. Matt Ajamian. Matt is an assistant research professor here working in ecology and conservation of exploited and vulnerable fish species like sharks and rays. And he's conducted research on a number of different topics, ranging from marine to estuarine systems, like our Indian River Lagoon, all the way out to ocean reefs and areas like that. So we hope that you guys will zoom in next week, Wednesday, April 22nd at 4 p.m. to hear more about him. If you want to learn more about Harbor Branch, then please visit us online at www.fau.edu/HBOI, where you can read more about our research and view our new page that highlights our great virtual resources, including all of our previous episodes of Behind the Science. So we hope that you guys, again, stay healthy and stay safe, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks.